The quickest way to measure a person is to watch how they treat someone they believe they will never need. The lunch rush filled the little neighborhood restaurant with the familiar sounds of clinking dishes, quiet conversations, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the warm afternoon air. Every table was occupied. Families laughed together. Office workers checked their watches between meetings. Regular customers greeted the staff by name as if they had been coming there for years. Hidden among the ordinary crowd sat Nathan Brooks, the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Holdings. His tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and calm posture quietly separated him from everyone else long before anyone recognized his face. He had chosen the restaurant because it was close to a business meeting, not because he expected anything memorable. As the first server approached with a welcoming smile, Nathan glanced at the name tag before politely saying, "Someone else, please." The young man looked surprised but nodded respectfully before walking away. A second server arrived moments later carrying a menu. Nathan offered the same quiet response. "Someone else." There was no anger in his voice. No impatience. Only cold distance. The dining room slowly became aware that something unusual was happening. The restaurant manager apologized and sent another experienced employee. Nathan thanked her politely before repeating the same request. Several nearby customers exchanged puzzled looks, wondering why no one seemed acceptable. No explanation followed. Then Emma Collins stepped from behind the counter carrying a simple porcelain coffee cup. She wore a neatly pressed white blouse beneath a black apron that showed the signs of another long shift. A few loose strands of blonde hair framed her calm face as she approached the table with steady confidence. She placed the coffee gently in front of Nathan without spilling a single drop. Before she could speak, Nathan looked at her name tag, paused for only a heartbeat, and quietly said, "Someone else." The room fell strangely silent. Even the manager seemed uncertain how to respond. Most people expected disappointment or embarrassment to appear across Emma's face. Instead, she offered the same warm smile she had given every other customer that afternoon. "Of course, sir," she replied softly. "I hope you enjoy your lunch." She picked up the untouched menu, wished him a pleasant afternoon, and walked toward another table where an elderly couple needed assistance reading the specials. Nathan watched her for only a second before looking back toward the window, believing the moment had ended. He did not notice the kindness she showed every customer she served, nor did he realize that the quiet waitress he had dismissed without a second thought was about to change far more than his afternoon. She was about to change the way he understood people forever. Nathan Brooks expected the restaurant to disappear from his memory before the afternoon ended. Instead, something about the quiet waitress continued returning to his thoughts long after his business meeting concluded. She had shown no frustration, no disappointment, and no attempt to impress him after he dismissed her as calmly as he had dismissed everyone else. That reaction felt unfamiliar. Most people either tried harder to earn his approval or quietly resented his distance. Emma Collins had done neither. She had simply continued serving every other customer with the same patient kindness she had offered him. The following afternoon Nathan found himself driving past the same neighborhood without any business nearby. Before he realized what he was doing, he parked outside the restaurant and walked inside once again. The familiar sound of conversations and fresh coffee welcomed him exactly as before. Emma was helping an elderly veteran settle comfortably into a booth near the window. She carefully adjusted the chair so the gentleman could sit more easily before kneeling beside his table to explain the daily specials at a pace that never made him feel rushed. After taking his order, she greeted a young mother whose little daughter proudly showed her a school drawing. Emma smiled with genuine interest, complimented every colorful detail, and handed the child an extra napkin so she could keep the picture clean. Nathan quietly observed everything from his table. No cameras followed Emma. No manager watched her performance. No one seemed likely to reward these thoughtful gestures. Yet she treated every person as though they mattered equally. Another server approached Nathan with a menu. This time he accepted without asking for someone else. As he waited for his lunch, he noticed Emma carrying heavy trays for a coworker whose wrist had begun bothering her during the busy shift. She never mentioned the favor. She simply returned to her own tables with the same calm smile. Nathan suddenly realized that he knew almost nothing about the people who serve him every day in restaurants across the country. He knew the names of chief executive officers, investors, and board members, yet he had never considered learning the story of someone whose work quietly made ordinary moments better for strangers. When Emma finally passed his table to refill another guest's coffee, their eyes met for only a brief second. She smiled politely exactly as she had the day before, offering neither judgment nor triumph. Nathan nodded almost instinctively. It was a small gesture that no one else noticed, but for the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether true character was revealed not by the people who held power, but by those who continued showing kindness without ever expecting recognition. 3 evenings later, dark clouds gathered over the city just as Nathan Brooks finished another exhausting meeting. Rain began falling in heavy sheets, forcing traffic to slow almost to a standstill. His driver suggested taking the highway, but Nathan quietly looked through the rain-covered window toward the familiar neighborhood restaurant. Without explaining why, he asked to stop there instead. The warm glow from the front windows stood in comforting contrast to the gray afternoon outside. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with customers escaping the storm. Families shook rain from their coats while office workers wrapped their hands around steaming coffee cups. Emma Collins moved through the crowded dining room with the same calm rhythm Nathan had come to recognize. She greeted every guest with quiet warmth, never allowing the growing crowd or the worsening weather to interrupt her patience. Nathan chose a small booth near the window and removed his damp jacket before noticing something unusual. A little boy accidentally dropped his cup of hot chocolate onto the floor. The child froze with frightened eyes, expecting someone to become angry. His mother immediately apologized, embarrassed by the accident. Before anyone else could react, Emma knelt beside the child with a reassuring smile. "It looks like the floor was thirsty today," she said gently. The little boy laughed with relief. Within moments she returned carrying another cup of hot chocolate, refusing to charge the family for the replacement. Nathan watched the entire exchange without saying a word. Minutes later, as he reached for his wallet to pay his bill, something slipped unnoticed from the edge of the table. It was the old Swiss watch his late father had given him on the day Brooks Holdings opened its first office. The watch landed beneath the booth without making enough sound to attract attention. Nathan stood to answer a business call near the entrance, completely unaware that he had left it behind. As customers continued arriving to escape the rain, Emma noticed a faint reflection beneath the table while collecting empty dishes. She carefully reached down and lifted the watch into her hand. For a brief moment she studied the worn leather strap and the tiny engraving on the back, recognizing that it carried deep personal meaning. Without opening it or calling attention to herself, she gently wiped away the rainwater with a clean linen cloth and placed it inside the restaurant office for safekeeping. When Nathan returned to his empty table several minutes later, he glanced at his wrist and immediately realized the watch was gone. For the first time that evening, genuine concern appeared across his usually composed face. Nathan Brooks searched beneath the table, checked every pocket of his jacket, and even retraced the few steps he had taken toward the entrance. The familiar weight that had rested on his wrist for nearly 20 years had vanished. For anyone else, it might have been an expensive watch. For Nathan, it was the final gift from the father who had taught him that success meant very little if it was not matched by character. He quietly informed the restaurant manager, assuring her that he was not blaming anyone. The manager immediately asked every employee whether they had seen the missing watch. Emma Collins listened carefully before remembering the reflection she had noticed beneath Nathan's booth only minutes earlier. Without saying a word, she walked into the small office behind the kitchen and returned holding a neatly folded white linen cloth. She gently opened it to reveal the old Swiss watch resting safely inside. The polished metal had already been carefully dried, and the leather strap lay perfectly flat. Nathan stared at it for a brief moment before slowly reaching forward. "You found it," he said softly. Emma nodded with her usual calm smile. I thought it might mean something important to someone. Nathan carefully fastened the watch back onto his wrist before looking at the tiny engraving on its back. His father had once engraved 5 simple words there. Always choose character before success. He had not read those words in years. Somehow they carried greater meaning now than they ever had before. Thank you, Nathan replied sincerely. Emma simply smiled. I am glad it found its way back to you. She returned to serving customers before he could say anything more. Nathan remained seated long after finishing his coffee. Through the restaurant window, rain continued falling across the quiet street, yet inside everything felt unexpectedly peaceful. As he watched Emma moving from table to table, he noticed details he had ignored before. She quietly refilled an elderly customer's coffee before he needed to ask. She helped a new employee organize several heavy trays without interrupting her own work. She thanked the dishwasher before leaving the kitchen with another order. Every gesture appeared natural, never performed for recognition. Nathan suddenly understood something that no business seminar or executive conference had ever taught him. Excellence was not always loud. Sometimes it revealed itself through the small habits repeated every single day when no one believed they were being noticed. As he prepared to leave, he glanced once more at the watch resting securely on his wrist. For the first time since entering the restaurant days earlier, he realized he had spent so much time judging the people serving him that he had forgotten to truly see them. Over the following weeks, the little neighborhood restaurant quietly became part of Nathan Brooks's routine. His assistants noticed that he no longer scheduled lunch at exclusive private clubs or luxury hotels whenever he had meetings nearby. Instead, he often requested the same modest restaurant with the warm wooden booths and familiar aroma of fresh coffee. No one questioned the change. They assumed he preferred the quieter atmosphere. Only Nathan understood that he had returned because the place reminded him that genuine character could never be measured by wealth or appearance. Each visit revealed another quiet detail about Emma Collins that no one seemed to notice. She arrived before sunrise to help prepare the dining room without being asked. She greeted every coworker by name before beginning her shift. She quietly shared homemade sandwiches with a young dishwasher who sometimes skipped lunch to save money. She remained the last employee to leave whenever extra cleaning needed to be done. None of these moments appeared extraordinary by themselves. Together, they painted the picture of someone whose kindness had become a habit rather than an effort. One afternoon Nathan arrived earlier than usual and happened to notice Emma leaving the restaurant during her short break. Curious without intending to intrude, he watched from a respectful distance as she crossed the street carrying a small grocery bag. Instead of sitting down to enjoy her own lunch, she entered a nearby rehabilitation clinic. Nearly 40 minutes later she returned with the empty bag and resumed her shift as though nothing unusual had happened. Nathan quietly asked the restaurant manager whether the clinic served meals for the staff. The manager smiled gently before shaking his head. Emma visits her mother there every day, he explained. She works 2 jobs to help cover the medical expenses while her mother recovers from major surgery. She never talks about it because she does not want anyone feeling sorry for her. Nathan looked through the dining room toward Emma, who was laughing softly with an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. There was no sadness in her expression. No trace of self-pity. She carried every tray with the same steady grace she had shown from the very beginning. At that moment Nathan realized that he had spent years admiring people for what they achieved while overlooking those who quietly sacrificed for others every single day. Wealth could purchase comfort, influence, and opportunity, but it could never purchase the quiet strength that allowed someone to carry heavy burdens without asking the world for recognition. As Emma placed another warm cup of coffee before a grateful customer, Nathan understood that the richest person in the room was not necessarily the one sitting in the expensive suit. Sometimes true wealth revealed itself through compassion that remained unchanged no matter how difficult life became. Nearly 2 months after his first visit, Nathan Brooks no longer recognized the man who had once asked every server to leave his table. The change had not happened all at once. It arrived quietly through ordinary afternoons, warm cups of coffee, and countless small moments that no newspaper would ever report. Yet life had a way of testing every lesson just when it mattered most. One Monday morning, Brooks Holdings announced that a major acquisition had unexpectedly fallen apart after months of negotiations. Financial analysts immediately filled television broadcasts with speculation while investors questioned the company's future direction. Nathan spent the entire day moving from one difficult meeting to another. Every conversation demanded decisions. Every ringing telephone seemed to carry another problem waiting to be solved. By early evening, exhaustion had replaced confidence. Instead of returning to his empty penthouse, Nathan instructed his driver to stop at the familiar neighborhood restaurant. The dinner crowd had not yet arrived. Soft music played quietly through the dining room while golden sunlight faded beyond the windows. Emma Collins noticed him enter the restaurant but immediately sensed something was different. The confident businessman who usually acknowledged everyone with a respectful smile now carried a silence that felt unusually heavy. She did not ask about the news she had heard earlier that afternoon. She did not mention the headlines appearing across every financial website. Without saying a word, she prepared a fresh cup of dark roast coffee exactly the way he had come to prefer it. She placed it gently before him and simply said, "You look like someone who needed a quiet place today." Nathan looked up, surprised by the simple kindness. For several moments neither of them spoke. The steam rising from the coffee drifted slowly between them while the restaurant remained peacefully calm. Finally Nathan smiled, though only faintly. "Most people want answers from me today," he admitted softly. Emma rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair before replying. "Sometimes people do not need answers first. Sometimes they need enough quiet to think clearly." Nathan wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, allowing the comforting heat to replace the tension he had carried since sunrise. No expensive consultant had offered him that kind of wisdom. No executive seminar had taught it. It came from someone who had quietly learned that kindness often meant giving another person space instead of advice. As evening settled outside the windows, Nathan realized that the restaurant had become more than a place to eat. It had become the one place where nobody expected him to be a billionaire. They simply treated him like another human being who occasionally needed a warm meal, a quiet table, and someone willing to listen without expecting anything in return. Several days after the difficult evening, Nathan Brooks returned to the restaurant much earlier than usual. Morning sunlight streamed through the front windows, painting long golden reflections across the polished wooden tables. The dining room was nearly empty except for a few regular customers enjoying breakfast before work. Emma Collins was arranging fresh coffee cups behind the counter when she noticed Nathan entering. She greeted him with the same quiet smile she always offered every guest. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nathan took his usual seat near the window and waited until Emma placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. For several moments he simply watched the steam rise into the morning light before finally speaking. "May I ask you something?" Emma nodded gently. "Of course." Nathan rested both hands around the warm cup. "Why were you always kind to me?" Emma looked slightly surprised. "Because you were my customer." Nathan smiled faintly and shook his head. "No. I gave you every reason not to be." Emma remained silent for a moment before taking a seat across from him only because the restaurant was still quiet and another server had already covered her tables. She folded her hands calmly. "People carry burdens that strangers cannot see," she said softly. "I decided a long time ago that I would not let another person's difficult day decide the kind of person I wanted to become." Nathan listened without interrupting. Her words sounded simple, yet they carried more weight than many speeches he had heard inside boardrooms filled with accomplished executives. Emma glanced toward the window where morning sunlight continued warming the empty sidewalk. "When my mother became sick," she continued quietly, "many people showed us kindness without asking for anything back. Some brought meals. Some simply listened. None of them knew how much those small moments mattered. I promised myself that if life ever became easier for us, would treat people the same way. Nathan lowered his eyes toward the familiar Swiss watch resting on his wrist. His father had once told him that respect was revealed by how someone treated people who could offer nothing in return. Somewhere along the journey of building an empire, he had allowed success to become louder than that lesson. Looking back at Emma, he realized she had never tried to change him. She had simply lived according to values that quietly invited others to become better. As Emma stood to return to work, Nathan spoke one more sentence before she walked away. You have taught me more about leadership than any executive conference I have ever attended. Emma smiled with gentle humility. Sometimes leadership begins with noticing the people who have been standing in front of us all along. Nathan watched her greet another customer with the same sincere warmth she had shown everyone else, understanding at last that greatness was never measured by the size of a company, but by the size of a person's character. The weeks that followed brought quiet changes that spread far beyond the walls of the neighborhood restaurant. Nathan Brooks no longer entered a room expecting special treatment. He greeted receptionists before executives, thanked janitors before investors, and learned the names of people whose work had once blended unnoticed into the background of every ordinary day. Employees throughout Brooks Holdings quietly noticed the difference. The chief executive officer who had once walked quickly through the lobby now paused to ask how someone's family was doing. He thanked assistants for staying late after difficult meetings and remembered birthdays that had previously passed without acknowledgement. No official announcement explained the change. It simply became part of who he had chosen to become. One Friday afternoon Nathan returned to the restaurant carrying only a small notebook instead of the briefcase that usually accompanied him everywhere. The dining room was lively with familiar voices, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee, and sunlight pouring through the front windows. Emma Collins welcomed him with the same warm smile she offered every guest. Nothing about her greeting suggested she expected gratitude or recognition for the quiet influence she had already had on his life. As Nathan waited for his lunch, he noticed a newly hired young server struggling to balance several heavy plates while trying to memorize customer orders. Months earlier he might have watched without another thought. This time he stood from his seat, gently opened the nearby door so the young employee could pass more easily, and quietly thanked him for working so hard. The young man looked surprised before smiling with genuine appreciation. Emma noticed the exchange from across the room but continued serving another table without interrupting the moment. She understood that true change never needed an audience. After finishing his meal, Nathan walked to the counter instead of waiting for someone to bring the bill. He thanked every member of the staff individually, including the dishwasher whose hands were still wet from cleaning breakfast dishes. Before leaving, he turned toward Emma with quiet sincerity. You never tried to change me, he said softly. You simply reminded me of the person I should have been all along. Emma smiled with the same peaceful humility that had always guided her actions. People usually remember the kindness they receive, she replied. Sometimes they only need time before they begin sharing it with others. Nathan stepped outside into the bright afternoon carrying those words with him. Looking back through the restaurant window, he saw Emma helping another family find their seats, laughing gently with a child, and thanking a coworker for something as simple as passing a coffee pot. Nothing about her had changed. Yet because she had remained true to herself, countless lives had quietly begun changing around her. Nathan finally understood that the greatest influence in the world often belonged to the people who never asked anyone to notice them. Autumn quietly settled over the city, covering the sidewalks with golden leaves that drifted gently beneath clear blue skies. Nearly a year had passed since Nathan Brooks first walked into the little neighborhood restaurant believing that no server could ever meet his expectations. Looking back now, he often smiled at the memory, not because he was proud of the man he had been, but because he was grateful that someone had answered his coldness with kindness instead of resentment. Brooks Holdings had grown stronger than ever, yet the greatest success Nathan celebrated could never be measured by financial reports. Employees described the company as warmer, more respectful, and more united. New leaders were promoted not only for intelligence but also for character. Gratitude had quietly become Part of the culture. One peaceful Saturday morning, Nathan returned to the restaurant before the breakfast rush. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows while the familiar aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. Emma Collins was arranging clean porcelain cups behind the counter exactly as she had done countless mornings before. She looked up and smiled with the same gentle warmth that had never changed. Nathan carried a small wooden box in his hands. When Emma approached the table, he placed it before her without saying a word. Curious, she carefully opened the lid. Inside rested a handcrafted porcelain coffee cup, simple in design yet beautifully made. Across its side, engraved in elegant lettering, were the words, "Character is remembered long after success is forgotten." Emma slowly traced the inscription with her fingertips before looking back at Nathan. "This is beautiful," she whispered. Nathan smiled quietly. "It reminds me of the lesson I almost missed." Emma closed the box with great care, treating it as though it held something far more valuable than porcelain. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight reflected across the windows while ordinary customers began entering the restaurant one after another. Nathan stood and picked up his empty tray before carrying it to the return counter himself. Several customers recognized the well-known billionaire but watched in quiet surprise as he thanked every employee before leaving. Emma simply smiled, because she understood that genuine change never needed applause. As Nathan stepped onto the sidewalk, he glanced once at the old Swiss watch resting on his wrist. Beside it, he could almost imagine the words his father had engraved years earlier quietly guiding him once again. "Always choose character before success." He walked into the bright autumn morning with a lighter heart than he had carried in many years. Behind him, Emma welcomed another customer with the same sincere kindness she offered everyone who entered the restaurant. The world might never know her name, but it would forever be changed by people whose lives had been quietly transformed because one humble waitress chose dignity over pride, compassion over judgment, and kindness over recognition. Sometimes the smallest acts become the greatest legacy because they teach another heart how to become gentle again.